And a very pleasant good morning to everyone. As we record this, it is Monday, May 7th, 2018, and you are listening to the very special episode of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling podcast, where the richness of wrestling is our business. We have a fine tasting here today for you folks. It's one of the best episodes that we're possibly going to be able to put on. Of course, no show would be complete without its host, and our host is the host with the most. He is the godfather of podcasting at Cage Side Seats, the indomitable TakersMinion. Taker, my friend, how are you? I know you're looking forward to today.
Good morning, Biff. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I am looking forward to today as we start delving into the territory days. In the first show, we talked about tag teams and women's tag teams with the Jumping Bomb Angels. And yesterday, we did a live show where we talked about Bruno is in his career. And that was only part one of the story. It turns out there's just so much to cover with him that we will be revisiting that in the future. We're joined by someone very special. Why don't you give her the introduction she so rightly deserves here, Biff?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have really someone that we've wanted on really from the very start. This was the first guest that we both agreed needed to be on, and needed to be on specifically for this show because of the perspective that she presents. Of course, you know her as a frequent contributor to the Shooting Debris podcast. You've seen her at Cage Side Seats. She is the one, the only, the incomparable LegendsLover. LL, thank you so very much for being here. It's really great to have you on here today.
Thank you. Quite an intro there.
Hey, this is the best intro money can buy. So,
ladies and gentlemen, please bear with her. She is. I might as well lay some groundwork for her. LL is my wife, my better half, the one, my steadily influence, my rock. She's my Bruno for my life. Let's put it that way. She is also a cancer survivor. She had cancer on the voice box and vocal cords, and over the last year now, she's finally been getting her voice back after almost 7 years of not having one. So, if she does sound a bit squeaky, but and she will fade in and out towards down to a whisper. But I'm just glad that she survived kicked cancer's ass for the second time in her life. And she's a much stronger person than I've ever thought I could be.
damn right. Damn right. It's going to be a great show here today. We are looking at the legacy of a wrestling promotion that for the better part of 30 years was not just one of the biggest in the country, but was really in many ways one of the best wrestling promotions in the country. Of course, we're talking about the American Wrestling Association. Now, Taker, you and LL both have a lot of fond memories of this promotion. You both kind of have firsthand experience of the company and watching the shows live. I'm going to defer to y'all today because I know that you have a lot of memories of the AWA and can kind of give a good perspective on what made the AWA so different compared to the other promotions. What made the AWA stand out for you personally as a fan?
What made it stand out to me as a fan is that was my first experience with any form of professional wrestling. I was 6, 7 years old, I think, when I first saw it. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to say something to you that most of you can't quite comprehend with the advent of cable and satellite TV and the reasonable and easy accessibility to it all. We didn't have that when I was a kid. All we had was I lived in Chicago for the first 11 and a half years of my life. And we had, CBS, NBC, ABC, PBS. That's the 4 on what we call VHF or regular TV. And then we had 26, 32, and 44 on UHF. And we had either the antenna on the roof, or the television antenna on the roof pointed towards Chicago, or in your attic pointed towards Chicago, or you had to use rabbit ears with tinfoil to clear up the reception on the TV. So yeah, we're talking old timey wrestling here.
You had to work for it, basically.
You did. You really did. You had to sit there. When you go to UHF, it wasn't click, click. No, it was just, try to pinpoint like you're dialing in a radio dial on a TV. But the first one time I ever saw it was on Channel 44 in Chicago, and it was the Chicago era based, which was part of Vern Gagne's group. Now, this is in the early 70s for me. 70, 71. And yeah, I'm old, folks. And my dad turned it on one morning. One day, it was right around 10 or 11 o'clock. I can't remember exactly what time of day it was, but it caught my attention. And I sat down and started watching it. And I saw wrestlers like Baron von Raschke, Nick Bockwinkel, Ray Stevens, George Scrap Iron Gadaski. And he was the perennial jobber for Vern and company.
He was the Brooklyn brawler of the promotion, basically.
No, he was the carpenter. He was a carpenter. He was a face, and the heels would always beat the living shit out of him, and he'd lose. He never really did anything at the quote unquote big shows, which were Friday nights and Saturday nights in Chicago and in Hammond, and those two. Hammond, Indiana, and those two places changed days of the week. 1 or 2 weeks in a row, it'd be Chicago on Friday night, and then it would be Hammond on Saturday night. Then it would switch. It'd be Hammond on Friday night and Chicago on Saturday night. So that's where all the main stuff was settled for my area anyway. And I saw, like I said, Dick the Bruiser, the Crusher, Baron von Raschke, Cowboy Bob Ellis, Wahoo McDaniels, Chief Billy Raincloud, or Red Cloud, I should say. And that was my introduction to wrestling, was AWA.
I want to pull out something that you mentioned there, and how your local area had, the specific markets that had, kind of the big angles living near Chicago. I'm going to give LL a chance to jump in here too, because if memory serves, well, you kind of had the Chicago wing of the AWA covered. She was kind of based out of Milwaukee. Is that correct, LL?
Yes, that is. And you figure the AWA was that north central area. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Chicago, Michigan, Indiana, that whole area there. I forgot what because I've been out of Milwaukee for a while, but I can't remember. I think it's the Bradley Center now is where they have their shows. They used to have it just at the arena, or the Mecca is where they would have their shows. You would have people. The Crusher used to be one that was there all the time. Baron von Raschke was there all the time. They put on their shows. You got all the bars around there. After their shows, they would go to the bars, drink and have fun with their fans. Because you figure there's quite a few of them that actually live there. So, they were home. A lot of the wrestlers were home.
Right, and so I think that kind of speaks to one of the real hallmarks of the AWA and really of the territories in general. It sounds like it was a very personal, a very intimate experience following some of these wrestlers, because, they weren't just working in these territories, they were living in these territories. And especially in some of the anchor cities for the AWA, like Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Chicago, You have
and sorry to interrupt it, but don't forget Indianapolis.
in Indianapolis as well. Yes, you have, the people here that are, you see them on TV, and then you actually can go out and see them in the local armory, the local arena for the bigger shows. If you were especially lucky, see them at one of the big stadium shows like at Comiskey Park. So, it's just one of the lost aspects of the territories, and the EWA being a good representation of that, of kind of the intimacy that fans had. And Taker, you mentioned some names early on here. Kind of give us a little bit of lay of the land. You were really coming of age in the 1970s, which was in many respects one of the heydays of the AWA. Give us a rundown of some of your favorite performers that you grew up watching, be it face or heel.
I got plenty of them. Like I said, I mentioned Bruiser and Crusher. They were my two. For those of you that know me on K-side, those two, Bruiser and Crusher, back then to me were like the Undertaker is for me now. Okay, I was the ultimate mark for those guys. I mean, seeing the videos, and there's short video clips on YouTube of the infamous steel cage match at Chicago Soldiers Field, where they took on, it was Bruiser and the Crusher with Jersey Joe Walcott as the special referee versus the Blackjacks. That was Lanza and Mulligan, with known then as Pretty Boy Bobby Heenan, in a white pair of pants and a white shirt that wasn't white when it was all over. Yeah. But yeah, the biggest the manager we had there, the only manager we really had there that was consistent was Bobby Heenan. When the original Sheik, Eddie Farhat, came into town, we would have Eddie Creechman, but he would work in concert with Bobby. Bobby was the guy, the manager in Chicago and in Milwaukee, for that matter. He had that whole managerial thing locked up, but no, that, like I said, so many names. I could bring up obscure names. There was a wrestler in Chicago that I saw many times. He was just a big fat ass. His name was Yukon Moose Cholak. And his mother and him owned a bar in Calumet City, Illinois, which is a eastern suburb. And he was always putting his mother's bar up as, if I lose this match, my mother and I will sign over the bar to you. Well, he never would lose that match. But that's because that's where all the wrestlers would go after the matches were over.
We're talking about some of these, angles that we remember from our youth watching, whether it be with you in the AWA or with LL and her experiences. It's just, you have little angles like that just kind of stick out, where they might not be, legendary moments in the history of wrestling, but that's what makes wrestling so great, is sometimes even the little innocuous things can just be so memorable. It just leaves such a lasting impact. I want to follow up on something. For people who only experienced Bobby Heenan in the WWF or in WCW, how close was Bobby in the AWA to what we saw when he moved to New York? Was he pretty much the same character, or was there, kind of a difference between what Bobby Heenan was in the AWA versus what he would become as Bobby the Brain Heenan in the WWF?
Oh, you're talking about the Weasel.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
As far as I've known with Bobby Heenan has always been a heel. He's always been a big mouth. He's basically been the same character his whole career. He started out as a kid. He started at the bottom, cleaning up the rings and everything else. He worked his way up, but he always worked. When he actually got in, he's always been a cocky son of a bitch. He's always known what he wanted, and he'd go and he'd get it. He was even that way as a wrestler.
Yeah, he was someone, because they do have a thing on the WWE network about him, you know, and it's a rather long video about him. And he started in Indianapolis, basically setting up, taking down the ring, carrying coats to the back, selling soda pop in the stands. That's how he got his start. He was helping to support his mother and grandmother, I believe it was, when they were living in Indianapolis. So, because he was born in Chicago. Bobby is a Chicago native.
Bobby has always liked wrestling. There was something about it. He had to get in any way he could, and he did. His mouth is actually what brought him into wrestling itself.
That was one thing he always could do, even as a young kid. He was able to sell and talk. And the promoter and the owner at that time, I can't remember the name of the owner in Indianapolis, but he was the one that recognized what Bobby was and got him in, taught him enough in the ring, how to take bumps and stuff in the ring and how, some basic wrestling stuff. But he was always destined to be in management as a manager. And he was if you look at managers today, the one that is the closest to Bobby right now is Paul Heyman. Paul Heyman takes a lot of what Bobby did, but turns it up to about 11 to make it his own. But Bobby was the prototypical manager, at least in my opinion anyway, because he was the only manager I saw for the longest time. It wasn't until later, like I said yesterday, when we were talking after our show, that I was introduced to Percy Pringle III, who was another one that took the same Bobby Heenan-esque stuff, made it his own, and turned it up to 11. So,
in the AWA, he also had Classy Freddie Blassie.
From time to time, I would see.
From time to time. Well, you figure he was the one that brought Hulk Hogan into the AWA.
Yeah, in Minneapolis. Yeah. But that's after I had already moved.
That's after you gone, but you figure you had him there. Classy Freddie Blassie was a manager unto his own. He didn't do what Bobby did. He was a heel, but he wasn't I don't know, he tried to be more charismatic than Bobby Heenan. But Bobby Heenan, with his mouth, the way he talked, you couldn't beat him. He could promote anything. He could take a shit wrestler and promote him as gold.
And have the fans believe it.
Yep.
That was Bobby.
He was one of the only managers that could do that. Actually, I shouldn't say one of the only manager that could do that. Take a mediocre wrestler and make him into a star.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to kind of highlight, how important that skill was in the territory era, because when you're running the same towns on a semi-regular basis, now I know the AWA had a bit of a bigger geographic area than other territories, but you're still running, a lot of the same towns on a rotation. You have to have the ability to talk the fans back into the next show, because if you can't keep interest up, the fans stop coming, and then you're out of a job. And so, you look at someone like Bobby Heenan, who has to have the ability to kind of talk away any possible defeat. He has to give the fans a reason to want to see him and his guys get beat up some more. And that's really one of the things that made Bobby Heenan so great. He paid his dues. He started from, working, behind the scenes to actually getting a shot to manage. But there was no guarantee that his spot would be secured. He had to go out and work hard. And I think that's one of the reasons why you remember Bobby Heenan so fondly today. Not only was he kind of the hardest working manager, one of the hardest working overall performers even, but he was so good at his job that he became kind of an inspiration for an entire generation of managers to follow.
He became an icon, yes.
Yeah, he was an iconic figure, but
Take it.
Bobby, the whole Bobby the Brain thing came about, when it actually started in the AWA because, and everybody thinks, oh no, that's a WWE thing. No, it's not. It was a AWA thing, is because Bobby at one point was the manager of the tag team champions, who was Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens. For the longest time, it was Bockwinkel and Stevens were the AWA world tag team champions. And
also, there's another thing though too. When he became the manager of them, that is when the Weasels came about.
Yeah, that's when all the Weasel stuff started coming about. But there is a promo on that same video I talked about earlier. Bobby saying that, Stevens and Bockwinkel, all they have to do is come to the arena, change, put on their boots, go to the ring and wrestle. I myself am handling their money, their bookings, their this, their that, their other. Everybody thinks I'm good looking and I'm a pretty boy, but I also have a brain, and I want to be known as Bobby, the Brilliant One Heenan. That was the first promo that started steering him away from the pretty boy, but everybody still called him Pretty Boy, or Weasel for that matter.
Yeah, I wasn't it the Crusher and that started calling him the Weasel?
Yeah, it was Crusher.
Because what he would do is he would weasel. The way they said it is because he would weasel his way underneath. He would crawl under the ring. He would do all kinds of stuff. He became the Weasel. And you figure a lot of the tag teams, they're the ones that really, really got in on it. You figure you had the High Flyers with Jumping Jim Brunzell and Great Gagne. Those guys were always in a feud with Bobby Heenan's guys.
Everybody for you do with Bobby Heenan's guys.
Everybody. But this was the biggest feud. Every tag team was in a feud with Bobby Heenan. But then when Nick Bockwinkel, the tag team broke up, Bockwinkel, when he became champion, Bobby Heenan was right there. He had the main champion. He had the tag team champions. There for a while, he managed almost every championship in AWA at one time.
Well, Ella, you just brought up a name that I would love to talk a little bit more about here, and this kind of provides the perfect segue into really what I think is one of the core treats or gems about the AWA for newer fans that get a chance to go back and experience this. When you talk AWA, you really have to look at some of the legendary performers, the iconic performers that kind of stand out as being the best of the best in the AWA. And really, there's two names that immediately jump to mind, especially for newer fans, and that would be Vern Gagne and Nick Bockwinkel. Talking about Bobby Heenan and his relationship with Nick Bockwinkel, LL, what are some of your memories of Nick Bockwinkel, getting to watch him growing up? Any fond memories of watching Nick do his thing in the ring? Because a lot of people, today, they don't appreciate how good Nick Bockwinkel truly was.
In his time, Nick Bockwinkel was good. Put it this way, the way a lot of people look at Ric Flair. In the beginning with AWA, Nick Bockwinkel was the Ric Flair. He brought out
the best,
the best way of dressing. He brought out the shades. Everything that you see Ric Flair started to do is what you see in Nick Bockwinkel. His wrestling style was great. The feuds him and Vern Gagne had were great. You're talking about the best two champions that AWA, the longest, they both, sorry.
Yeah, her voice is cutting out on her. But I get what she's saying.
It's the echoing.
It's because you're hearing me.
Sorry, my echoing. That was echoing so bad. But you're looking at two champions that, if you look at the records for holding the title championships, those are the top two in AWA. These two were unstoppable. Even though Vern Gagne was the promoter, owner, everything, he was a champion. Him and Nick Bockwinkel had so many wars. You tuned in every week just to see who was going to get the better of each other every week. And that made it good.
It did. And I saw Vern as the champion when I was a kid. So I can talk more about Vernon, but I can also say about Nick. Both Vern and Nick were great shoot wrestlers too. And there was such a trust between Vern and Nick that they would call a match on the fly in the ring, and they would shoot on one another with holds. And they would take it, to the point that it literally hurt, but they wouldn't intentionally hurt one another. That is a trust that you won't probably ever see again. And one of the reasons why Vern was a champion, the AWA World Heavyweight Champion for so long, is that he couldn't trust anyone to carry the title and carry the company, because back during this time, back during the 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s, it was no big of a deal for a wrestler who had a title to jump ship. Stan Hansen did it to Vern. He jumped while he was champion and went down to WCCW. And before he sent the title back, he ran it over with his truck.
It's kind of hard for newer fans to appreciate, the gravity of what you're talking about, but that was a very real threat, especially in the territory era when guys had different places to go work. Your word was your bond, and
Yes.
that bond could be broken quite easily. You had to have, a certain caliber of person to hold the title with all the responsibility. You had to be a good worker, but you'll also notice, especially in the 60s and the 70s in the AWA, with the NWA champion as well, and even to a certain extent in the WWF, your top wrestler needed to be, capable of handling themselves in case someone went into business for themselves, because there was always the possibility someone could try to shoot, and I can't imagine that working out very well, trying to shoot on Vern Gagne. But that was a very real fear. That title was the lifeblood of your company, and you had to protect it.
Yep. Now, when you talk about the three of them together, when you talk about the AWA, their biggest competition was the NWA. None of us, as a kid, I never heard of the WWF or anything. The only ones that I always heard of was the NWA. And you figure they used to have, at times, you would see the AWA go against the NWA. They would have special matches, special times where you'd see these two territories wrestle each other. Those were great. They would have great matches, but there was still that trust issue. Vern Gagne didn't trust a lot of people. He didn't trust the NWA, but he trusted them more than he would any other territory.
And I'm going to say this right now before we go any further. The AWA was the last territory holdout during the takeover of the wrestling industry by one Vincent Kennedy McMahon. Everybody else was gone, and I mean, except for overseas. I looked up the list of the territories up until 1993. There were over 50 different individual territories in the United States and worldwide in the NWA at that time. Over time, that started in 1948. The NWA from 1948 to 1993 was a grand total of over 50 individual territories. And the AWA was the last one to surrender to Vince.
And it was a hostile surrender.
Yes.
I don't think even though Vern is in the Hall of Fame, that one there was the toughest one for Vince McMahon. Vern was not giving up.
Yeah, I think it's prudent to note, when you're talking about, professional wrestling and the history of wrestling, a lot of people kind of remember the war between the WWF and WCW in the 90s and early 2000s. The Monday Night War, of course, is a very prominent subject that a lot of people study on. But there was a war in the 80s as well. It was a war as much for the soul of wrestling as it was, profit. You had three big players on the national landscape in the 1980s. You had Vince McMahon in New York, you had Jim Crockett in Charlotte, and you had Vern Gagne and the AWA in Minneapolis. And for a time in the 80s, this was not only a bitter war, but it was a war that really anyone could have wound up winning. There were different parts where
it was bitter, and it was also violent. It was very violent, hostile.
Well, the first domino that fell from AWA was Bobby. But the thing about Bobby was he did it the right way. And that's one thing you could always say about Bobby. Wherever he was, he would give his notice, finish up his book dates, and then leave. Everywhere he worked. AWA, WWF, WCW.
He was also in the NWA for a while.
That's what I call WCW. That's what NWA.
That was a takeover, yeah.
That was what the NWA basically became once Ted Turner bought out Crockett.
Yeah, and with Bobby Heenan, the thing is he knew that the AWA wasn't going to last because they were going broke.
Well, once Hogan left.
Well, Vern Gagne, he tried his damnedest to keep it, but he took all his money to keep it afloat. He literally went broke trying to keep that company.
Yeah, he did. He died broke.
He died. He also died very bitter.
Yes. And it wasn't until after he died that he was inducted into WWE Hall of Fame. And because to this day, I believe he would have refused it.
His son, Greg, is the one that made peace with Vince McMahon.
Mm-hmm.
Because his father did deserve, Vern Gagne did deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. But he died a broke, bitter man. And you can't blame him. That was his legacy. He tried to save it, to hold on to it. He just couldn't. Vince McMahon was getting too big, and he couldn't hold out anymore.
Well, when we look at the landscape in the 80s, and especially WWF in the 1980s, I think it's prudent to note, just how many stars Vince McMahon would put on his TV programming that would come from the AWA. Now, you have some big names, Bobby Heenan. On the production side, Gene Okerlund, Mean Gene, came from the AWA. You had Hulk Hogan.
The Killer Bees.
The Killer Bees. You had Kurt Hennig, Mr. Perfect. Sherry Martel had spent some time in the AWA. There's just so many different names that people associate with the WWF that really got their start in the AWA or had a big moment in the AWA. Of course, one of the unsung heroes of the AWA in the mid-1980s, that would become a WWF superstar later on, Rick Martel, former world champion in the AWA.
Correct. General or Sheik Adnan LKC. General Adnan.
Didn't Sergeant Slaughter also start there?
Yes, he did. Sergeant Slaughter. That's another one that left.
They all started, a lot of them started in the AWA. Well, like we said, the Killer Bees. What a lot of people don't know is they used to be the High Flyers. And when that was lost.
It was Gagne and Brunzel.
Yep, Greg Gagne actually did go to the WWF or WWE.
WWF at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just an incredible wealth of talent. You know, we need to bring up Scott Hall. Scott Hall was working in the AWA as well. The future Alundra Blaze was working as Medusa in the AWA. She would go on to some fame in WCW as well. There's just so many legendary figures. I want to talk a little bit about Hulk Hogan in the early 1980s. Hulk kind of got his start down in the Florida area. He also worked a little bit in Memphis. And he had a cup of coffee in New York as a heel with Freddie Blassie for a time. He had a big match with Andre the Giant at Shea Stadium. But if we're talking Hulk Hogan, really his big start in the business, you know, the moment where he really kind of connected with American audiences was in the AWA. Do either of you have any memories of Hulk and his face turn that kind of kick-started the Hulkamania movement?
I don't, but I can tell you I saw Terry the Hulk Boulder in Mobile, who is quote-unquote Hulk Hogan, also known as Terry Boulea. Yeah, folks, that's his real name.
That's how he started in the AWA.
Okay.
Like we said, classy Freddie Blassie. Like you said, he met in New York. Classy Freddie Blassie is the one that brought him into the AWA and managed him there.
Yeah, and
by the time Blassie was in the came to the AWA, Bobby was already gone.
Yeah.
So they needed, and Gagne never trusted Blassie anyway. Not like he trusted Bobby. So I mean, Vern held on for so long. I think to the point where it was too long. And they forged a group with, where was it? I saw it here. He formed a group with, let's see, during the 80s, he forged an alliance with several NWA promoters, including Jim Crockett Promotions, Mid-South, Pacific Northwest out of Portland, World Class Championship in Dallas, Continental Wrestling Association in Memphis. God, there's some other promotions we can talk about later.
Didn't he also form one with Devon Eriks?
That's the World Class Championship.
That's what I thought.
Yes, the old Pro Wrestling USA promotion that ran for a little while.
Yes. And it didn't even stand a chance against the machine that was the WWF even then. I mean, with the quote unquote bootlegging of video, across the country, that is what basically killed the regional territories in the end.
Well, with Vern Gagne, the ones that he was trying to get in with were ones that were big wrestling families, not just these separate ones. He chose to try to stick with the big families because they, in his eyes, they were more trustworthy.
Yeah. He trusted Fritz. He trusted Jim Crockett, which turned out to bite him in the ass in the end.
That bought it. Yeah, that did not work out too well.
Because Ted Turner came in and bought it, and then Ted Turner didn't buy it. Vince bought it, and then Ted. I don't know how it worked out that Ted wound up with it, but.
Well, one of the interesting things, when they did the Pro Wrestling USA, David Crockett actually went behind the scenes and tried to sign some AWA talent. So David kind of was acting as a mole almost for Jimmy Crockett, who, I'm not going to mince words here. I'm from Charlotte, and so I have a soft spot for Crockett. Jim Crockett had aspirations of going national too, and so he was kind of, almost the lesser of two evils with respect to Vern Gagne, because while Vince was raiding the pantry, there were some defections to the NWA as well. We have talent like the Road Warriors. Larry Zbyszko would end up going. You had some AWA guys defecting to the NWA just as you did the WWF at this period. And that might have been as much of cause of the failure of Pro Wrestling USA as anything. There's just so many cooks in the kitchen. But we talk about the AWA, and it's kind of weird to think now that we're getting on towards the point where we're as far away removed from the end of the AWA as the AWA's length of existence. But the AWA, for anyone that grew up watching it, the AWA had a very specific style of wrestling that was presented.
Yes.
And that's a hallmark of the territories. And I want to get your opinion, LL and Taker. I want you to jump in here too. Describe for some people the style of wrestling that the AWA presented, because there were a lot of differences between watching the AWA and watching Continental in Memphis or World Class in Texas.
Well, the AWA, they did have a lot of technical wrestling, but they had a lot of brawlers.
A lot of brawlers. You would see a lot of color in the AWA matches. A lot of color, Yes, people. If you even on the Saturday morning and Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning shows, wrestlers would bleed.
Crusher and Ray Stevens were the biggest bleeders they had.
I mean, I saw a match between Bruiser and Stevens at Chicago's International Amphitheater in 1975, where I'm sitting 2 rows from the ring. And Bobby, now, when we were talking about Bobby Heenan, the manager, earlier, something that a lot of people don't know is that Bobby wore tights most of the time, tights and boots. He didn't wear all the fancy clothes all the time. He would wear tights and boots a lot of times because, like, he was on the quote-unquote undercard or dark matches. He always looked like he was ready to wrestle. Very seldom did he ever wrestle, but he wrestled on occasion and basically was the heel that just got the piss beat out of him, and he would bleed. He was a bleeder along the lines of Ric Flair. Now there was the ultimate bleeder. Bobby bled so much. I mean, but getting back to my story, Bobby went to interfere in the match. He went to grab Bruiser's leg from underneath and missed. Bruiser turned around and ran him into the post. I see him go down on the opposite side of the ring from me. When he comes up, he's got the full crimson mask going on. He ran it, And then the following Saturday morning, they're doing studio interviews, and Bobby's talking about it, wearing a bandage on his forehead. Even back then, the continuity of the story was kept more so.
It was more believable.
Yeah.
Well, like I said with Crusher, you would never see an interview with him after a match that he wasn't bleeding.
Or he wasn't wearing a bandage of some kind.
That would be later on, but it's right after a match. You always seen the red face. It was the brawling. It looked more real. It was more natural. These feuds, you would swear these feuds were real. Even though they'd go out drinking afterwards, you would know you looked at it as it was real.
Yeah, it was just, you didn't have to jump as far as you do today with a suspension of belief. You would actually believe that these two individuals, these two wrestlers, hated each other's guts. The way they would fight, the way they would wrestle in the ring. They weren't doing a lot of the stomping punches or the stomping kicks.
They were just doing regular punches, regular brawls. Yeah. Well, like we were talking about with the drinking afterwards, you'd swear there was a feud. Ken Patera was with the AW. Afterwards, they'd all go out drinking. Problem is, a lot of these are in your hometown. They go out drinking, and the fans believed it so much that the fans would actually pick fights in the bar with the wrestler. They could take them on because they thought it was fake. And they find out they get their ass kicked. They're not fake. I mean, the match is predetermined, but these guys would literally fight in there.
Yep, and a lot of promoters would say if you're not beating, you're in a bar drinking and you don't kick the fans' ass, you don't work for me.
That's right.
Vern was one of them. And
How drunk do you have to be to pick a fight with Mad Dog Vachon?
How drunk do you have to be to pick a fight with the Crusher?
Oh, sweet Jesus.
You don't have to be that drunk. It's the mentality of people. Crusher, I grew up with Crusher living about 8 blocks away from me. He lived in my hometown of South Milwaukee. He lived 8 blocks away from me. He used to be in the bars all the time. There was constantly fights. People would do this. I went to school with one of his nieces. My dad went to school with him.
Hell, your dad drank with him.
I mean, these guys, even in school, you think back in high school, there was fights because there was a wrestling background and fighting in their background in school. And I mean, people, these days, you're not going to see fans pick a fight with a wrestler. But back in the late 70s and 80s, fans did it all the time. You had wrestlers going to jail because they were still considered dangerous. You get drunk, you get into a fight, who's going to get arrested? It's going to be the wrestler.
Well, didn't it get to the point in South Milwaukee that whenever Crusher got in a fight, the cops would arrest the guy that picked the fight?
What? It got to the point, a lot of times the cops were called to let them know where he was going. So they already knew where he would be.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's something, isn't it? And even though she won't say it, won't talk about it, I'm going to bring it up. I don't know who has the picture. I believe her mom has one.
Not anymore. They're gone.
Of my wife, LegendsLover, sitting on the shoulders of one Reginald Terry, the Crusher Lasowski's shoulders as a kid. I think, what, 7 or 8 you were? Maybe? Or 5. She says about 5 or 6 years old. That is something that if we ever could get our hands on or find it, I would love to have, because that is a piece of memorabilia that has directly touched my family, our family.
Well, you look at it like Stephanie McMahon said with Andre the Giant. Look at her when she was little. That is something you never forget. But this is something I grew up with, so I'm so used to it. I could meet one of the wrestlers today, say hi, and that's it.
But if it was the Crusher, it would be hi and big hugs.
Yeah. But I mean, it's just the wrestlers today, they're regular people. So me, it's not fandom so much. It's just I enjoy the sport because it's something I grew up with.
And that's the key right there. You grew up with it. There's, it's a nostalgia for, when we talk about the AWA, a bygone era that doesn't exist anymore, but it's the memories of what used to be. And that is what makes wrestling fandom so powerful. It sticks with you year after year. And, we're looking at the legacy of the AWA here today. And you notice, we really, just kind of talked about memories that y'all had and some of the big names. This is not the only AWA show that we're going to be doing. As we have just scratched the surface. We're going to have an entire series of shows on the AWA regarding the history and how the promotion was founded. We'll talk some more about the big matches, some of the legendary characters that we remember. We can even talk about, the end of the AWA and its last year's being on ESPN. But for this kind of opening show,
I have my opinions on that. Those were some of the most ridiculous matches. The only decent match, the ones that you're talking about, was the 1-hour time limit draw between Nick Bockwinkel and Kurt Hennig before Hennig jumped. Yeah, they were going to put the belt on Hennig, and he gave his notice the night of that match.
At the end, it was sad.
Yeah.
The last few matches, even the last year of it, it was sad the way the AWA ended because it wasn't very good anymore. Because all your good stars, the people that actually made it were gone.
It's definitely an intriguing story, not only how the AWA came into existence, but the end of the AWA, and kind of looking at, the experiences that the people involved had. But to kind of close out this opening show, I wanted to focus on one particular area, and both of you as fans of the AWA, could weigh in really on this. I want to gauge, LL and Taker, if you had to choose one memory above all others that kind of embodied the AWA for you as fans, what is the enduring memory of the AWA for you personally?
The Crusher. Having the Crusher, Dick Murdoch, Ray Stevens, those were the core guys of the AWA. They had the best memorable matches, and they were real. I mean, they were real people. The way they acted, yes, they were loudmouths and everything else, but you know what? In real life, they were tough guys too. They were regular, hardworking people that loved everybody. Those are my best memories, is that little core group.
I echo the sentiments of LL, the core group, the people that, the memories I have, and I can sit there and just close my eyes and go back at times, and I've done this, and she see me, and she's like, what you thinking about? And I would bring up a match that I saw on television or something, but the core group was a Bruiser to Crusher, Stevens and Bockwinkel, Murdoch and Rhodes, because yes, and they were the original Texas Outlaws, and they were heels back in the AWA. The Blackjacks,
Bobby Heenan.
Heenan.
My best memory that sticks out the most in my mind is the first time that they got Bobby Heenan and they started calling him the Weasel. When he got the name of the Weasel.
Yep, I remember that. It was on TV after a match, at a TV match that Crusher was involved in, and he goes, and Bobby interfered and passed the illustrious taped up brass knuckles to.
It was a roll of quarters.
Well, yeah, roll of quarters, but they called it. It was the ever.
No, it wasn't quarters. His thing was the taped up roll of dimes.
Yeah, taped up roll of dimes. And the referee never saw it, of course. We all know that the referee was oblivious to the heels getting the foreign object passed by Bobby.
Even after the roll broke open and dimes were everywhere.
He still didn't see the dimes all over the ring. I mean, some of it was a little overboard, but yeah. And that's where the whole Weasel thing came about. And then Greg had the run of matches with the actual Weasel suit. Which that was, Greg Gagne would put him in the sleeper hole, put him to sleep, put him in the Weasel suit, and
wakes up and he's trying to get. Or when Bobby started with his tuxedos and they stripped him in the middle of the ring.
Down to his underwear, yeah. Underwear and socks. And shoes.
I mean, they had some comedy. They had the real matches and the comedy to go with it. That was the best. You don't see that anymore.
No. Nobody today can book matches like they were done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They just can't. There's too much political correctness today. The sponsors back then turned a blind eye to the bloodshed that would be going on and everything like that. It was just it's a different animal today. And like you've said, Biff, and we repeat it constantly out here. Ladies and gentlemen, please go back and look. I mean, you'll find the AWA matches that are on the network are from the near the end. The 90s and stuff like that. They're the late 80s and early 90s. They're not as good as the matches that myself and LegendsLover watched. Those you can go find on YouTube, but you'll only find blurbs and bits and pieces of these matches that have been spoken about. Because, I mean, how absurd would it be, or how absurd is it, I should say, to have a television taping in a studio with maybe 50 people in the studio, in a ring that was like, I think, 16 by 16. It was a small ring, hard, old boxing ring.
What was funny about the AWA is a lot of their matches that you'd see on TV everywhere, they were all house shows.
They had some that were house shows, but you also had the studio taping shows. And how many studio taping shows does anybody know where people would actually bleed? You would see bloodshed in television taping shows.
Because
they wouldn't stop the match because of it. They'd let the match finish.
What they were doing then, even on their tape shows, as their house shows, when the wrestlers got in, they did what they always do. Mm-hmm. No matter if it's taped or not. This is what they were. They were showmen. But also back then, you had a lot of technical wrestling.
Yeah.
Which you don't see a lot today. You see all the high flying. They want to do the daredevil stuff today. They don't have the brawling. They don't have the technical wrestling that they used to have.
You wouldn't see a 7-foot man in Braun Strowman jumping off the top rope and doing superplexes off the top rope. No, Braun Strowman would just stand in the middle of the ring and let you run into him, and every time you ran into him, he'd punch you in the face.
You wouldn't see a Shane McMahon do his coast to coaster jumping off a cage. These cage matches, they had then, when they had cage matches, they used the cage. You were beating somebody. You were throwing him into the cage. You were grinding them into the cage. That's what a cage match was. Now, you got people climbing on top, jumping off. You got them trying to climb out of a cage. You didn't have that then.
No. The match was settled with a 1-2-3 in the middle of a padlocked cage. Period. Just escaping the cage to win, over the top or through the door.
No.
Or a pinfall or submission. No. AWA way was settled in the ring. There was a padlock on the gate, and the referee in charge in the ring had the key. And he would open the door when the match was over. That's how it was, plain and simple.
The storylines, the feuds were more real.
Yeah. You couldn't, we all know that it was, like we all said, it was all predetermined. And we know there was some showmanship and acting involved. But in an overall sense, you couldn't tell if it was real or not. The anger and the despite and the hatred that you would hear these wrestlers say, and the words that were said to each other, and the things that were said, it's a whole different animal.
And those feuds could go on for years.
Oh, those blood feuds did some last for 12 to 24 months, you would see.
I mean, constantly. They would go on. They would last for years. And the feud at the end of the year, 2 years, would be just as strong as it was in the beginning. Not this why we get tired of them now, because they seem to be. It's make-believe. Then the wrestlers, their acting would make it real. And it was always a good watch at week after week after week after week.
Well, what made the AWA good too is this. They didn't have pay-per-view when I was a kid. They didn't have pay-per-view until what, the 90s, Biff?
They don't have internet.
Yeah, well, some of the first AWA pay-per-view was in the 1986, I believe it was.
Okay.
1987, in that
so
range.
You look at my upbringing. The only way you would see a match really involving the feud that's being discussed in the studio interviews was to go to either Minneapolis or to the Milwaukee Mecca or go to Chicago's International Amphitheater, or you would go to the Hammond Civic Center in Hammond, Indiana, or you'd have to go down to Indianapolis to the Orpheum, I believe it was. They did it at,
or watch it on TV.
But you wouldn't really see. They would only show highlights. 2 or 3 minute highlight pieces, and it would be just enough to get you to go, damn it, why didn't I go? And I would sit there and beg and plead with my dad to take me to the matches.
I'm going to put you on the spot, and this is a great way to punctuate this episode, talking about the memories of the AWA. I asked the same question to both of you. One word that best sums up the AWA to you. Taker, I'm going to start with you. What's the one word that comes to mind that best describes the AWA?
You bastard.
That's 2 words.
Oh, that's a very interesting way of remembering the AWA.
No, I'm not saying the one word I could say about it was realism.
LL, what's the best way for you to remember the AWA? The word that comes to mind.
Life.
We talk about the AWA. We talk about the memories that, exist for the company, the ups, the downs. I think, we touched on a lot of themes here today that just kind of embodies what wrestling was all about growing up, for all of us in the territory era, but just, in general, when you're a young fan, it's the passion, the power of these memories, the nostalgia, the fondness of thinking back on how it used to be. This is what made, LL and TakersMinion fans of the business. It's what made me a fan of the business. It's, the passion for wrestling and, the realism of it, the intensity. It's more than just, what you see on Monday nights today. There used to be some real fire in wrestling. There used to be, intensity that doesn't really exist in an era when everybody knows, what the score is and how wrestling is basically carried out. It's just a different era. And if you didn't get to live through it, it's hard to appreciate just how great wrestling used to be. But that's what's so great about this podcast. We have the ability to go back and look at wrestling, and just kind of explore a different era, a bygone era that, while it may not exist anymore, it lives on not only in the memories of the fans who watched it, but we can find videos on YouTube, on the network, just kind of exploring how great companies like the AWA truly were.
Yeah, it was a great company. It's a company I miss, and it's an era I miss. And, I keep getting told by a lot of people on cage side seats that it's not going to be the way it was anymore. And I know that. And a part of me dies whenever it's said to me, because it was something that every Saturday and Sunday mornings and afternoons, it was something I looked forward to as a kid, because it was, I believed it was real. It got to the point with my father, and it's his fault that I got into it, that he didn't watch it anymore because I became so obsessed with it.
You got it with your dad. That's how I started. Is with my dad. Used to sit and watch it every weekend.
We could do it, and it's so hard to look at the product today. I look at it now as more soap opera than I did back then. Back then, to me, it was all, there's that meme or that gif out there. It's still real to me, damn it. Back in the day, it was real to me.
Yeah. It
was real to LegendsLover over here. It was real to everybody that watched it during that time. I don't know. I mean, I don't call this what we have today actual wrestling. I call it more ballet, really.
Would it be fair to say that it's the difference between sports entertainment today and what pro wrestling used to be? Wrestling versus sports entertainment?
Yes.
Yes, it's a big difference.
Well,
There's a big difference. And what we need, and there's one promotion out there right now, in my opinion, that is the closest to the old school stuff. And believe it or not, that promotion doesn't make a dime off of itself. That's Lucha Underground. That was the kind of set. That's if you look at the setting that they're in, the temple in Boyle Heights, California. That was the kind of seedy, greasy, nasty places that wrestlers in the early days of my fandom and LLs for that matter was the kind of places that these guys worked in. I mean, Crusher, wrestled on weekends most of the time, and during the week he was a bricklayer. He built many houses in South Milwaukee as a bricklayer. He wasn't famous in South Milwaukee because he was a wrestler. No, he was famous in South Milwaukee because he built a lot of houses. And you see, that's something a lot of people don't understand. Now, wrestling back then wasn't the multi-million-dollar a year thing that it is today. These guys did the sport of professional wrestling because they loved it. They didn't make a lot of money. I can almost assure you that a main event shot in the 60s and 70s, when I was watching it, the wrestler maybe got $50. He would go out there and pour his soul, his blood, sweat, and tears in the ring to give us something of quality and something that we could remember even today. As like I said, 9 years old, sitting 2 rows from the ring and remembering exactly what happened when Bobby Heenan was thrown into the post by Dick the Bruiser. And Bruiser shortly thereafter pinning Ray Stevens and winning the match. That leaves an effect on you. And Bruiser didn't make a lot of money. Hell, he died. When he died, he was working out at home, getting ready to do a two-shot Sunday for his own promotion. And he was 68 years old.
There's passion involved. There is the intensity of the action, the realism, the love of professional wrestling, not only from the performers in the AWA, but the fans, the love of what they've watched, the love of what they used to remember wrestling being like. There's so much that we have still to cover. And this is, our MO here. We give you a little taste. It's a little bit of a wine tasting here of the AWA. We want you to go out and explore, what made the AWA so special. Go out and find those matches of Vern and Dick the Bruiser and the Blonde Bombers. We didn't get a chance to cover yet with Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens.
They're more Ray Shire and the Cow Palace Wrestling.
Yeah, there's just so much, and we could talk about Shire and San Francisco.
Sorry to step. I could bring up Pepper Gomez because he was in Chicago. I could talk about Pepper Gomez and the car being run over his stomach in the Volkswagen being put on his stomach in Chicago.
We got so much. We have so much, and we are going to cover it. This is the first of many episodes dealing with the AWA. So don't, obviously we have so much more, from the history, the champions, the memorable moments. I'm sure we'll talk about the Wrestle Rock Rumble at some point just to give everybody a laugh. But, we're going to have so much more on the AWA. There's so many great moments yet to come that we're going to cover. I don't want to spoil next week's episode. We talked a little bit about it yesterday after we went off the air. Suffice to say, you're going to love next week's episode, so you definitely want to be tuned in. We are unfortunately running out of time here today, but I want to go ahead and get a few plugs out of the way. Of course, we are a member of the Cage Side Seats community, so you can find us there. We also have a couple of associated podcasts. Of course, we have Two Guys, One Sport, Crazy Chris and George at Saves.
At Sabes.
At Sabes. That drops 9 p.m. Thursdays. I believe they're on a hiatus until June, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, they are.
So they'll be back in June. Of course, we have the granddaddy of them all, the greatest wrestling podcast for my money, with Shooting the Breeze, TakersMinion and Mr. Dr. Senju. That drops 11 a.m. Eastern Saturday mornings. Of course, we have Match Fixing with Don Sell. Drops on Friday. Got a few Cage Size Deets associated podcasts that also drop on Friday. The Ruthless Aggression Era podcast, Metal Matt, covering the Ruthless Aggression Era of the WWE. That's on Friday evenings. We also have the Violent Wrestling podcast. It is back and better than ever. Ambrose Alley and Prince Moxley Lopez doing their business.
Check your local listings on that.
Yep, and
it varies from time to time.
Yeah, they had a show last night actually covering Backlash. That's available on YouTube now, so you can go to their channel and find that. Yours truly hosts the Queen City Express with Ryan Sayo. That drops Thursday afternoons, live stream on YouTube, 4 p.m. Eastern. Of course, be sure to check with us every week on this channel for more content from the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. Got very special shows lined up. It's going to be a lot of fun. And, of course, we'll be back talking about the AWA here soon enough. I want to extend a very special thank you to LegendsLover for joining us today. LL, we're going to have you on more. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Hopefully my voice will hold out longer.
That sounded just fine today. So thank LL for being here with us. Taker, my friend, thank you. It's been a great joy. This wrestling podcast is getting a lot of views. It's getting a lot of support from friends, from listeners. We got a lot of good stuff coming their way.
Yes, we do, my friend. Yes, we do. You all, as always, you guys can find me at Takers_Minion on the Twitter birdie thing. And you can find me in Cage Side in the daily and in the nightly. This has been the third episode of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I bid you good day.
Thank you very much for listening, everybody. We'll see you next week with the Connoisseurs of Wrestling.